The first time the music swelled and no one came for her, Eleanor truly believed it was a mistake. The chandeliers of Lady Penbury's ballroom were a cascade of crystal stars above her head, scattering light over silk and satin, over glittering diamonds and laughing mouths. 16-year-old Eleanor Ashbourne sat on the very edge of a gilded chair against the far wall, gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap that the tips of her fingers tingled. Her dance card, freshly written in her own careful hand, lay open, pristine. Any moment now, she told herself. Any moment, someone will come. She had done everything her mother requested. The dress was a becoming shade of blue, chosen to bring out what little color you have, my dear. Her hair had been dressed with ruthless determination by Marianne's maid after finishing with her younger sister. Rings of golden curls for Marianne, soft brown, waves for Eleanor, pinned neatly, if not fashionably. A string of pearls, borrowed from her mother and worn with grateful awe, rested against her collarbone. Across the room, Marianne was already laughing up at a handsome lieutenant, the feather in her hair trembling with her delight. Eleanor watched as the gentleman scrawled his name boldly across her sister's card before sweeping her away into the waltz. Marianne's blue skirts flared, a mirror of Eleanor's, but on Marianne the blue seemed brighter, more alive. The opening strains of the dance washed over Eleanor like cold water. A gentleman near the refreshments glanced in her direction. She straightened, feeling her heart quicken. He turned away. Her shoulders drooped before she remembered herself and forced them up again. She smoothed her skirt. Another gentleman passed by, one who had smiled at her during tea a week before. He caught her eye, hesitated, then looked beyond her as if she were part of the paneling. The first waltz passed, then another. Her card remained untouched. Her mother approached once, fan snapping impatiently against her wrist. "Sit up straight, Eleanor. You look defeated. No man wants a girl who looks as though she has already lost." "I am only resting, Mamma," Eleanor murmured. "You have not danced once," Lady Ashbourne replied in a low, tight voice. "Do you think I do not see?" Her gaze flickered across the room, landing on Marianne for a brief, approving smile before hardening again as it returned to Eleanor. "At least try to look pleased to be here. We have not the luxury of failure." When she walked away, Eleanor became aware of the whispers. They moved through the air like drafts in an old house, felt more than seen. Two ladies with feathers like plumes of a tropical bird flicked, their eyes toward her and turned, heads bent close. A young man laughed a little too loudly, glancing from her to his companions. Eleanor caught only fragments. "Poor thing, Ashbourne's eldest. That business with the ships, said to bring misfortune." Her throat tightened. The ruin of her father's shipping investment had been the talk of the season the previous year, but she had not understood, not truly, how ruin clung not just to ledgers but to names, to daughters. "A wallflower," someone said plainly, not bothering to lower their voice. "Every ball must have one, I suppose." The word struck her like a slap. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she lowered her gaze to the blank white of her dance card until it blurred. She clung to the edges of the card with numb fingers, willing it to change, for ink to appear as if by magic. No one came, not that night, nor the next ball, nor the one after. Seasons blurred into one another, marked only by new gowns stitched over old seams, the ever-deepening lines of worry around her mother's mouth, and the gentle, crushing sameness of sitting against distant walls while the world spun and laughed without her. Marianne bloomed, of course, gathering admirers like petals. Suitors came and went, promises were made and broken. Eventually Marianne married a baron with kind eyes and a generous estate. Eleanor smiled through the wedding breakfast and pretended not to notice how her mother avoided her gaze whenever someone mentioned prospects. By the time 12 seasons had passed, the word wallflower no longer stung. It had sunk too deeply into her bones for that. It had become simply who she was. On the first night of her 12th season, Eleanor sat once more along the familiar stretch of wall, this time in the mirrored ballroom of the Duke of Harbury. She was 28 now. The blue of her gown was darker, more subdued. Her hair, still thick and brown, was threaded with a few discreet pins of jet instead of pearls. Society regarded her with the politeness reserved for furniture, noticed only when one tripped over it. She told herself she had come only to please her mother, now more brittle than sharp, her health faltering along with their dwindling. Finances. A match was unlikely at this point, but a miracle, she supposed, was not entirely impossible. "What would you do if someone actually asked you to dance, Eleanor?" Marianne had teased earlier that evening as they sat side by side while the maid arranged their hair. Marianne, now Viscountess Elmsley and mother to 2 small boys, still retained the glow of those early seasons. "I should probably faint from the shock," Eleanor replied, dryly, earning a delighted laugh from her sister. But now, surrounded by the hum of voices and the sweep of music, the old ache returned. 12 seasons, 12 years of being invisible. She focused on breathing, on the cool touch of the chair beneath her gloved hands, on the pattern of light on the polished floor. She refused to let longing make a fool of her again. A sudden hush rolled through the room. The musicians faltered for the briefest of moments before catching themselves. Conversations dipped, then rose again in a more contained murmur. Eleanor looked up, following the line of every gaze. He had arrived, the Duke of Ravensfield. Eleanor had never met him, but she knew the stories. Everyone did. They were whispered behind fans and over cards, embroidered with each telling. A duelist, some said, a man who had seen blood on foreign soil, a widower whose first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, a protector of no one, ally to none, the most feared duke in England, and the only one who seemed to prefer it that way. Sebastian Blackthorne stepped into the ballroom as though it belonged to him, as though every crystal and candle existed merely to throw light on his dark figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black, with a single silver pin at his cravat, he carried the room's unease like a cloak. For a wild, senseless moment, his gaze swept the line of chairs along the wall and stilled on her. Eleanor's first thought was that he must be looking at someone behind her. That was the only sensible explanation. Men like the Duke of Ravensfield did not look at women like Eleanor Ashbourne. His gaze, dark and steady beneath the sweep of the chandeliers, must be fixed on some graceful creature just out of her line of sight, a swan among lilies. Not the quiet stone placed at the edge of the pond, but no one sat behind her. He took a step forward. The ripple that went through the crowd was almost audible. A dowager's fan froze mid-flutter. A young lady, midway through a laugh, faltered into silence. Even the Viscountess Elmsley, Marianne, radiant in pale green near the center of the room, turned her head sharply, eyes widening as she followed the same line of sight. He cannot be. Someone whispered behind their gloved hand. Surely not her. Eleanor heard it. She heard everything in that moment, every incredulous murmur, every tiny intake of breath. It all seemed to press in on her as the Duke of Ravensfield crossed the floor, unhurried, as though he were not overturning the laws of their society with each step. He moved with a controlled power that made the polished floor seem to yield beneath his boots. His hair was raven dark, threaded at the temples with the faintest suggestion of silver. There was a fine pale scar along his jaw, half hidden by the shifting shadows of the room. His mouth was set in a firm line that suggested he was very rarely amused. He stopped before her chair. For an endless beat, no one moved. Eleanor stared at the embroidery on his waistcoat, black on black, subtle as breath, because she did not quite dare lift her gaze to his. Her heart thudded against her ribs in an uneven, disobedient rhythm. "Miss Ashbourne," he said. The sound of her name in his voice startled her more than a shout would have. It was low and smooth, but with some rough edge beneath, as if unused to gentleness. She looked up. His eyes were not cold as she had expected. They were dark, yes, and guarded, but there was something else there too, something like recognition, as though he stood not in a glittering ballroom, but at the threshold of a memory. "Your Grace," she managed, and prayed her voice did not tremble as much as she felt it did. He inclined his head, the barest gesture, yet even that simple courtesy drew another rustle of surprise from the onlookers. The musicians, rattled by the room's shifting attention, fumbled for a moment before settling into the next waltz. The familiar swell of strings rose, filling the silence that had opened around them. Like a circle, he extended his hand. Every instinct bred into her over 12 fruitless seasons screamed that this must be some mistake, some cruel jest about to reveal itself. Yet his gloved hand remained there, steady, waiting. "This waltz is yours," the Duke of Ravensfield said quietly, "if you will grant it to me." The world tilted. Eleanor stared at his hand, at the long, strong fingers that could not possibly be reaching for her. She thought wildly of the untouched dance cards of her youth, of the way her mother's mouth had tightened over the years, of Marianne's kind eyes when she thought Eleanor wasn't looking, of every whispered, pitying glance. "Go on, dear," someone hissed from the chairs nearby. Eleanor did not know who. "Do not just sit there." She placed her hand in his. Heat shot up her arm through kid leather. He closed his fingers gently but firmly around hers, and drew her to her feet with an effortless strength that made her feel weightless and unsteady all at once. They stepped onto the floor. Like birds flushed from cover, couples parted to make space, forming a wide ring around them. Eleanor felt the weight of 100 stairs, sharp as pins. Her steps faltered, but his hand at her waist was sure, anchoring her as his other hand held hers in proper frame. "Look at me," he murmured, just for her. "Not at them." She obeyed. Up close, his features were more worn than distant legends suggested, fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a faint shadow of tiredness beneath. This was not the untouchable villain of drawing-room stories. This was a man who looked as though he had stared down storms. "You are trembling," he observed, as they began to move. His lead was precise, unyielding, yet strangely considerate, as though he had measured each step to suit her. "I have not danced in some time," she admitted, then immediately wished she had bitten her tongue. "Not in 12 seasons, he corrected softly. Her breath caught. She stumbled, and he tightened his hold, guiding her smoothly through the turn so that no one beyond their small circle could see. "How could you possibly know that?" Eleanor whispered. Something flickered in his gaze. "Because I was there," she frowned, trying to reconcile the impossible statement with the fragmentary images of her past seasons. Ballrooms, candlelight, names and faces that blurred into one another. Not his, surely not his. "I think I would recall if the Duke of Ravensfield had been present," she said, a hint of dryness slipping out before she could stop it. One corner of his mouth threatened, almost, to soften. "And yet, Miss Ashbourne, it seems there is a great deal you have not been permitted to recall." They turned again, skirts whispering, the music swelling around them. Her body remembered the pattern of the waltz, even as her mind spun. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked, the question torn from somewhere deep. For a moment, he did not answer. They moved as one through the figure of the dance, his hand at her back, a constant, unyielding presence. At last, he spoke, so quietly she barely heard him over the violins. "Because I am tired," the Duke of Ravensfield said, "of watching you pay for my sins." Her heart lurched. Before she could form a single word, the music began its final sweep. The waltz drew them inexorably toward its close, and Eleanor realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that when the last note faded, nothing in her life could possibly be as it had been an hour before. As the music died away and the room held its breath, the Duke's hand slipped from her waist, though he did not yet release her fingers. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, his voice steady while her world tilted on its axis. "Tomorrow morning at 11, I will call upon your mother." And in the stunned silence that followed, with every eye upon them, he bowed over her hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The silence after his bow lasted only a heartbeat. Then the ballroom burst into sound, louder than before, as though the entire company had been holding its breath and now exhaled at once. Laughter rose too high, conversations turned too bright and brittle. Somewhere, a woman's fan snapped sharply in two. Eleanor stood very still. The Duke of Ravensfield straightened and released her hand at last. Whatever had passed between them on the dance floor, whatever astonishing words he had spoken, his expression now was once more the composed, faintly forbidding mask she had seen when he first entered. "Good evening, Miss Ashbourne," he said, as though the world had not just shifted on its axis. "Good evening, Your Grace," she replied automatically. Then he turned and walked away. The crowd parted before him like water, closing in behind him, and in a moment he was surrounded. Men eager, women curious, all jostling for even a fragment of his attention. Not one of them seemed to remember that a few minutes earlier they had been staring at her as if she were some strange insect that had landed on the finest silk. "Eleanor!" Marianne's voice cut through the din. A moment later, her sister swept toward her, a blur of green silk and urgent concern. Her eyes were wide with incredulity, and for once delight warred with genuine alarm. "Are you quite well?" Marianne demanded in a fierce whisper, seizing Eleanor's hands. "You are white as paper." "I am—" Eleanor searched herself, but there was no single word for this feeling. "I am standing. That is a beginning," Marianne murmured, squeezing her fingers. She glanced past Eleanor's shoulder at the churning center of the room. "Eleanor, he danced the entire waltz with you. The entire thing. I thought poor Lady Penbury would swoon from sheer shock. Mama—" At that, Eleanor stiffened. "Where is Mama?" Marianne's lips thinned. "Just there. Do not look all at once," which of course meant Eleanor immediately looked. Lady Ashbourne stood not far away, her fan held so tightly that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. Her eyes were fixed on the Duke, but not with awe or speculation like the others. Her gaze was hard, cold, and, Eleanor realized with a small jolt, filled with something very like fury. "Mama is angry," Eleanor said slowly. Marianne exhaled. "Mama is terrified. She will call it anger because that is easier to hold." Before Eleanor could answer, their mother swept towards them, skirts whispering, a storm contained in steel-grey silk. What did he say to you? She demanded without preamble. Every word, Eleanor. Do not omit a syllable. Eleanor blinked. He asked for the waltz, Mamma, and then at the end he said he would call upon you tomorrow, at 11. Lady Ashbourne closed her eyes, briefly, as if bracing herself against some invisible blow. When she opened them again, they were bright and sharp. You will not repeat that to anyone, she said. Not a soul. Do you understand me? But Mamma, Marianne protested. People see what they wish to see, Lady Ashbourne snapped, then lowered her voice with effort. We will not add fuel to this spectacle. Eleanor, we are leaving. Already? Marianne asked aghast. Now, there was no arguing with that tone. Within minutes, their carriage rattled away from Ravensfield House, the light and music shrinking behind them into a distant glow. Eleanor sat opposite her mother, Marianne between them, the three of them swaying with the movement of the wheels. For once, Marianne was silent. So, Lady Ashbourne said at last, staring fixedly at the darkness beyond the window, the Duke has decided to stir old ghosts. Eleanor's fingers tightened in her lap. Mamma, do you know him? Know him? Her mother gave a brittle laugh. Every ruined ledger in this city knows him. Every cold parlour where a fire might have burned, had there been coin enough for coal. He was not always the Duke of Ravensfield. Once he was merely Sebastian Blackthorne, and your father called him friend. The carriage lurched over a rut. Eleanor felt the words like another jolt to her bones. Friend? She repeated. Then why? Because, Lady Ashbourne said, turning on her at last. Your father trusted him with figures and contracts and schemes, and when the storm came, when those wretched ships went down and scandal threatened to splash his fine family name, Sebastian Blackthorne stepped neatly aside and let us take the wave full in the face. Her eyes glistened, though her voice did not waver. Do not be fooled by a waltz and a bow, Eleanor. That man knows how to calculate. Silence fell. The only sound was the steady clatter of hooves on cobbles. Eleanor thought of his hand at her back, guiding her through the dance, of his voice, low and rough-edged, saying, I am tired of watching you pay for my sins. If he had cast them aside so ruthlessly once, why did he look at her now with something almost like remorse? Sleep came in restless fits that night, punctuated by fragments of music and the memory of dark eyes watching her across crowded rooms she could not quite recall. When dawn finally bled pale light through her curtains, Eleanor rose with a head that ached and a heart that refused to be sensible. By 10:30, their small drawing room had been transformed. The worn sofa had been beaten free of every last speck of dust, the threadbare carpet brushed, the mantel arranged with their best, though slightly chipped, china ornaments. Marianne had arrived early, ostensibly to support her sister, though her sparkling curiosity made it clear she would sooner die than miss the scene. At 11:05, Lady Ashbourne stood at the window, her posture rigid, watching the street. He may not come, Eleanor offered quietly, though she did not know whether the thought was a balm or a blade. He will, her mother said. Men like him do not waste an opportunity to remind one of one's place. The clock on the mantel ticked, each second an excruciating tap against Eleanor's ribs. Then, precisely as the long hand touched the hour, carriage wheels sounded outside. The house seemed to hold its breath. A firm knock resounded through the hall. The door opened. The butler, borrowed from Marianne's household for the occasion, as their own aging retainer had been deemed unsuitable, announced in a sonorous tone that seemed to tremble faintly nonetheless, His Grace the Duke of Ravensfield. Sebastian Blackthorne stepped into the Ashbournes' faded drawing room as though it were the grandest salon in London, and Eleanor knew with a sharp, inexplicable certainty that whatever he said next would alter not only her own life, but the story she had been told about her family for 12 long, silent years. For a moment, no one spoke. The Duke of Ravensfield stood just inside the doorway, the light from the street behind him outlining the breadth of his shoulders, the severe line of his coat. The Ashbournes' drawing room, with its faded rose wallpaper and carefully mended curtains, seemed to contract around his presence. He bowed, first to Lady Ashbourne, then to Marianne, and lastly to Eleanor. His gaze lingered on her a fraction longer, and that alone sent Eleanor's pulse tripping. Your Grace, Lady Ashbourne said, every syllable clipped. You do us an unexpected honour. On the contrary, he replied, straightening. It is an honour long overdue. Her mother's jaw tightened. Pray, be seated, Your Grace. He crossed the room with that same controlled grace Eleanor had felt in his hand the night before. Rather than take the best chair by the fire, he chose the slightly worn armchair opposite, the sofa where Eleanor and Marianne sat, leaving the place of command by the hearth to Lady Ashbourne. An acknowledgement, Eleanor realised dimly, of whose territory this was. Tea, Mamma, Marianne offered a little too brightly. No. Lady Ashbourne remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair as though she needed its support. "I think we may dispense with niceties given the history between our families." Sebastian, Blackthorne met her gaze without flinching. "As you wish, my lady." Eleanor watched the two of them, her mother sharp and taut with old hurt, the Duke composed but with that familiar tension at the edges. There was something in the way they looked at one another that spoke not just of transactions and ledgers, but of winters endured, of doors that had closed and never opened again. "You were a frequent guest in this house once," Lady Ashbourne said, voice low. "My husband thought highly of you." "I thought highly of him," Ravensfield answered. "And yet when the scandal came," she went on, "when the ships went down and the courts whispered and the papers circled like crows, it was our name that was torn, our credit that vanished, our invitations that stopped. We waited for you to call. You did not." Eleanor's heart squeezed. Marianne looked down at her hands. The Duke's jaw worked once, a muscle tightening there. "No," he said quietly, "I did not." "Why?" The word escaped Eleanor before she could stop it. Both her mother and the Duke turned to her, as if surprised she had spoken at all. His gaze settled on her, steady, dark. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. Lady Ashbourne sucked in a breath. "Whatever else I am," he continued, "I will not dress it in prettier clothes. Your husband," he looked briefly at Lady Ashbourne, "entered into a partnership with my late father. The venture was sound enough, but the manner of its funding was not entirely proper. When the first ship was lost, the situation could still have been remedied, had we been swift. My father chose to safeguard the Ravensfield name first. I did not oppose him as I should have." "You profited by our ruin," Lady Ashbourne said, voice trembling. "You let my husband carry the full weight of blame." "I profited in title only," he answered, a flash of something grim crossing his face. "I inherited an estate washed clean in other men's blood and sweat. Do you imagine I have not thought of that with every coin I spend?" It was not contrition as Eleanor had imagined it, no florid apologies, no attempt to touch her mother's hand. It was something harder, rougher, like a confession dragged over gravel. "And now," Lady Ashbourne demanded, "what spectacle was last night intended to be, Your Grace? Penance, entertainment? I will not have my daughter made a pawn in—" "It was not a spectacle," he interrupted, voice low but suddenly edged. "I have watched your daughter sit at the edge of every ballroom for 12 seasons, watched men measure their prospects and turn aside because a whisper about your family's misfortune cost them nothing, while a dance with a wallflower cost them pride." Eleanor's cheeks burned. "You watched?" His gaze softened. "Just a fraction. The first season after your father's death, I attended a ball at Penbury House. You were 16. You sat in the far corner, in a blue gown too thin for the draught that crept under the doors. You held your dance card as if it were a lifeline." He paused, eyes distant, as if he could still see her there. "I stood 20 feet away and did nothing." The room seemed to blur around her. "That night," he went on, "your mother approached me in private. She informed me that if I ever attempted to present myself here, not as a penitent investor, but as a suitor, she would have me turned from the door. She would not accept charity disguised as a proposal," she said. "Your future would not be bought with guilt." Lady Ashbourne's fingers tightened on the chair. "I stand by that. Perhaps you were right then," he said. "You may still be right now. But last night when I saw Miss Ashbourne once more pressed against a wall while the rest of the room danced," he drew a breath, "I found I no longer cared what name society gave my motives." Eleanor's heart hammered. "Then why have you come, Your Grace?" she whispered. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a storm held rigidly at bay. "I have come," Sebastian Blackthorne said, each word deliberate, "to ask for your hand in marriage, Miss Ashbourne." The clock on the mantel ticked absurdly loud. Lady Ashbourne swayed, catching herself on the chair. Marianne's mouth fell open. Eleanor could only stare, shock crashing over her in a cold, bewildering wave. "You may refuse me," he added, his gaze never leaving hers. "You would be well within your rights. But whether you accept or not, there is one thing I will set right before I leave this house today." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded, age-yellow document, sealed with a crackled blob of red wax Eleanor recognized from her childhood. Her father's seal. He held it, unbroken, between his fingers. "This," the Duke said quietly, "is the confession your father wrote on the night he died, addressed to me and to you. And it is time, Miss Ashbourne, that you finally knew what it contains." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Lady Ashbourne said very quietly, "That is impossible. My husband left no such thing." Sebastian's fingers tightened on the folded paper. "He entrusted it to a clerk in our solicitor's office the day before the inquest. He instructed that it be given to me only if the worst occurred. It was. I have kept it since." "Why?" Lady Ashbourne's voice sharpened. "Why hide it from us all these years?" His gaze did not waver. "Because I did not know how to act. upon it without tearing away what little protection your pride still afforded you, because you forbade my involvement, because I told myself that to interfere further would compound the harm already done. He exhaled, the sound scarcely audible, and because I was a coward, as I have said. Eleanor swallowed. May I see it? Her mother's head snapped towards her. No. Mamma, you do not need to read your father's confessions, Lady Ashbourne hissed. You know all that matters. He trusted the wrong men. We suffered for it. That is the end. It is not the end if there is a letter with my name upon it, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. Her heart pounded, but the decision formed clear and stubborn in her chest. If Papa wrote to me, then I have a right to read his words. Marianne's hand found hers on the sofa, squeezing in silent support. Sebastian looked between mother and daughter, as if weighing something. Then he rose, crossed the small distance, and held the letter out towards Eleanor, carefully, almost reverently. It is addressed to Sebastian and my girls, he said. It was never meant for my eyes alone. Lady Ashbourne's breath hitched. For a moment Eleanor thought she might snatch the paper away, but she did not move. Only her fingers dug deeper into the worn fabric of the chair. Eleanor took the letter. The wax crackled as she broke the seal. Her hands trembled. The thick, familiar sprawl of her father's handwriting swam before her eyes until she blinked hard and forced herself to focus. My dearest girls, she read silently, lips moving without sound. And you, Sebastian, who have been as a son to me. Her throat closed. She blinked again, and the words steadied. He spoke first of love, of pride in his daughters, of regret for every moment he had chosen his desk over their company. Then slowly the sentences darkened. He wrote of the partnership with Lord Ravensfield, of ambitious plans and unsteady foundations, of shortcuts taken, signatures applied where they should not have been. It was my greed as much as his, the ink confessed. Do not let them tell you I was a blameless lamb. I knew the risks, and I took them. I signed my name where I ought to have. I refused. When the storms came and the ships went down, I understood at once that someone's name would wash away with them. Eleanor's eyes blurred. A tear dropped onto the page, smudging a word. She bit her lip and read on. Sebastian is young yet, and his father, not a man who forgives weakness. If blame must fall, let it fall on me. My title is small, his is a fortress. I do not say this to excuse him, but to spare him the blow that would otherwise crush him. You may think this foolish pride, perhaps it is, but a man must stand somewhere when the tide rises. There was more. Instructions for the household, his wish that Marianne marry for kindness rather than glitter, a plea that Eleanor not be allowed to fade into the shadows for the sake of her mother's wounded dignity. She will guard you with steel, he had written of Lady Ashbourne, but pride can be as cold as hunger. Do not let it become your only cloak. Finally, at the end, a line that made Eleanor's breath leave her in a soft, broken sound. If ever Sebastian seeks to repair what was broken between our houses, I beg you, at least hear him. Do not let my mistakes be the end of both your stories. The letter slipped a little in her grasp. Marianne reached to steady it, tears bright in her own eyes now. Mamma, Eleanor whispered, did you truly not know of this? Lady Ashbourne's face had gone ashen. He spoke of a letter, she said hoarsely. The night before her voice faltered. I told him I wanted no documents passing between his hand and Lord Ravensfield's ever again. I thought it was some new scheme I did not know. She sank slowly into the chair, as if her knees would no longer hold her. The room felt suddenly very small, the air thick with years of mislaid blame. Eleanor looked up at the Duke. You have kept this for 12 years, she said. Why come now? Because 12 years of silence have not lessened my guilt, he answered. Because my father is dead, and I am free at last to untangle his knots as I see fit. Because I have come to despise the man I become each time I walk into a ballroom and see you pressed against a wall, wearing your father's ruin like a shroud that does not belong to you alone. He drew a breath. I cannot undo what was done, but I can do this. I have prepared documents to restore to your family a share of the income from the docks built with your father's investment. It will not erase the winters you have endured, but it will mean you never endure another. I will make public the truth of the venture, my own part in it and my father's. Your father will not be remembered as a cheat, but as a man who bore more of the burden than he should have. Lady Ashbourne flinched. You would parade our shame through the papers again? No, he said. I would move it from your shoulders to mine, where it should have rested from the beginning. He turned to Eleanor. I will do this regardless of your answer to my proposal. Restitution is not a dowry. It is simply justice, long delayed. But if you choose to become my wife, you will have not only my name to shield you, but my partnership. I would have you as something far more dangerous than a decorative duchess, Miss Ashbourne. I would have you as my equal. The word hung between them, strange and glittering. Eleanor's heart ached. torn between the old story she had carried like a stone and this new raw truth unfolding in her hands. She could feel her mother's fear, Marianne's hope, her own longing, like a fragile, stubborn flame. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "Then say nothing for now," he replied. "Think. Read your father's words again. Ask me what you will. I will not pressure you for an answer tonight, or tomorrow, or next week." His mouth tightened. "But there is one more thing you must know before you decide. The world has called me many things. Duelist, scoundrel, widower. They will call you worse if you take my name." He met her gaze, and for the first time since he had entered, something like dread flickered there. "Before you can weigh the cost of binding your life to mine, Miss Ashbourne," Sebastian Blackthorne said quietly, "you must hear how Lady Ravensfield died." For an instant, Eleanor thought she would refuse to hear it. Everything in her recoiled from the rawness of his gaze, from the sense that if she stepped across this threshold of knowledge, there would be no going back to the safer stories whispered behind. Fans, yet something in her father's inked plea, "If ever Sebastian seeks to repair, at least hear him," pressed against her ribs like a hand. "Very well," she said quietly. "Tell me." Sebastian's shoulders lowered by a fraction, as if he had been braced for refusal. He did not sit. Instead, he moved to stand near the window, half turned away, as though he could not bear to look directly at them while he laid his ghosts bare. "You know the version they prefer at card tables and supper parties," he began. "That I am a man who delights in violence, that I drove my wife to an early grave and fought a duel over the inheritance before the soil on her coffin had settled." Lady Ashbourne's mouth thinned. "I have heard versions. They are not entirely wrong," he said, and Eleanor felt Marianne's fingers tighten around hers. He looked down at his gloved hands, flexing them once before letting them still. "My marriage to Lydia was arranged before either of us had sense enough to object. She was lively, clever, far too clever to be impressed by a young lord who believed himself invincible because he could ride well and quote Latin. A faint, almost wistful smile ghosted over his face and vanished. "We were not in love. We were allies, more or less, against my father's temper and her mother's ambitions." He drew a breath. "A year into the marriage, the doctors warned us that she was not strong. There was some weakness in her lungs. They feared a pregnancy would strain her beyond recovery. They advised caution, rest, time." "And your father?" Lady Ashbourne asked, though the answer was already written in the tightening of her jaw. "Wanted an heir," Sebastian said simply. "Ravensfield titles do not pass themselves, you see. I told myself the doctors were overly cautious, that Lydia was stronger than they believed, that if we were careful," his voice roughened. "It does not matter what I told myself. What matters is that I did not stand between her and the pressure being applied from all sides." Eleanor felt suddenly cold. "She conceived," he went on. "At first she was almost triumphant, as if she had proved them all wrong. But the illness came with the winter. Fever, a cough that would not cease, bleeding that frightened. Even the most blasé of our physicians," his jaw clenched. "She refused to go to her mother's house. 'I will not die under her thumb,' she said. 'If I go, she will spend my last days telling me this child was all I was good for.'" His gaze flickered to Eleanor, as if he saw in Lady Ashbourne's rigid posture some echo of another unyielding matron. "The night she died, I received a challenge," he said, "from a man whose brother had lost heavily at my table. I had already begun to earn the reputation you see distilled into those little stories. I had never refused a challenge. It was," he shook his head, "it was what proud young men do when they have more courage than wisdom." "You did not go," Marianne blurted, unable to stop herself. "Surely you did not leave her." "I went," he said, and the two words hung in the air like a knell. Silence fell. Outside, a cart rattled past, oblivious. It was well before dawn, and the doctor assured me she would rest till morning. I told myself the man would not actually shoot. Few duels end in anything more than a graze and humiliation. But a misfire, a stumble, he took a bullet to the chest. He lived, but barely. The scandal was immediate. I returned home to find the house in chaos. Lydia had worsened. The strain, he closed his eyes briefly. She delivered too soon. The child was stillborn. She followed before the sun was high. The room blurred at the edges. Eleanor pressed a hand to her lips. She had never cared for the tales of blood and honor that so enthralled some men, but she felt now, with sick clarity, the way those choices rippled outward into women's lives. "They say I killed her," Sebastian said quietly. "They are not entirely wrong there either. I did not pull the trigger or set the fever in her lungs, but I walked away. When I should have stayed, I bowed to my father's demands when I should have fought. It is a pattern with me, you see, one I am determined at last to break." Lady Ashbourne's eyes glistened, though they still burned. "And you think taking my daughter into a house lined with ghosts will mend this pattern?" "I think," he replied, turning fully to face Eleanor at last, that offering your daughter a choice where others were given none is the first step toward mending anything at all. Their eyes met. In his, she saw no plea for absolution, no slick attempt to paint himself as victim, only a man standing in the wreckage of his own history, asking if she would dare build anything on such ground. Eleanor forced herself to breathe. If I were to accept you, she said slowly, it could not be from gratitude or pressure, or because my father wished it on a dying page. I will not be another woman carried along by your decisions until it is too late to make my own. A flicker of respect kindled beneath his weariness. Good, he murmured. Then we understand one another. I need time, she said, to think, to read Papa's letter again, to decide what I believe of you, with my own mind, not Mamma's, not society's. You shall have it, he answered. I will set the legal matters in motion regardless. You may judge my character as my actions unfold. He inclined his head to Lady Ashbourne. I will not trespass longer today. You have much to discuss as a family. He took his leave with formal courtesies, though his hand lingered for a heartbeat over the back of Eleanor's chair as he passed, a fleeting, grounding touch no one but she could feel. When the door closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale. Eleanor, Lady Ashbourne whispered, you cannot, seriously. A sharp rap at the front door cut her off. Moments later, the borrowed butler reappeared, a folded newspaper in his hand, his expression oddly strained. This has just arrived, my lady, he said. The morning edition. I thought you would wish to see it. Lady Ashbourne took it, unfolding the pages with trembling fingers. Her eyes flew to the headline, and all colour drained from her face. What is it? Eleanor asked, dread coiling in her stomach. Her mother looked up, shock and fury warring in her gaze. He has done it, she whispered. Dear heaven, he has actually done it. She turned the paper so they could see. In thick black letters that would by now be spilling across every breakfast table in London, the words screamed, Duke of Ravensfield confesses role in dock scandal. Ashbourne name cleared at last. Eleanor stared, her heart pounding, as the full weight of what he'd set in motion crashed over her like a wave. The headline stared back at her long after the ink had stopped swimming. Eleanor read the words twice, then a third time, as if they might rearrange into something less impossible. Her own family name seemed to glow on the page, freed at last from the shadow that had clung to it for 12 long years. Ashbourne name cleared at last. Behind those 4 words was an article spilling details. The docks, the lost ships, the questionable contracts. Sebastian's confession was not melodramatic. It was measured, precise. He laid out his father's role, his own silence, the unfair distribution of blame. He named her father not as a villain, but as a man who had borne more than his rightful share of scandal. He has ruined himself, Lady Ashbourne whispered, almost to herself. He has taken a knife to his reputation in public. For us, for truth, Eleanor said quietly. He said he would. Marianne, leaning over her shoulder, gave a soft, incredulous laugh through her tears. You must admit, Mamma, as grand gestures go, this is considerable. Lady Ashbourne sank back, the newspaper slipping a little in her hands. For the first time in Eleanor's memory, her mother looked not commanding, not furious, but lost. What am I to do with my anger now? She whispered. I have tended it like a coal for so long. It kept me warm when the house was cold. Eleanor folded her father's letter carefully, tucking it back into its cracked envelope. Perhaps, she said slowly, we might let Papa's words warm us instead. The days that followed were a blur of knocks at the door. Old acquaintances who had not crossed their threshold in years suddenly remembered them. Freshly inked invitations arrived, teas, musicales, dinners, en petit comité, that would nonetheless be full of eyes assessing how an Ashbourne behaved now that she was respectable again. Eleanor watched the sudden change with a curious mixture of amusement and weariness. Where once she had been furniture, she was now a curiosity. The woman whose name had been restored by the city's most dangerous duke. Some looked at her with sympathy, some with envy, some with thinly veiled calculation. Do you regret it? Marianne asked one afternoon as they walked in, the small overgrown square near the house. That he published it all without warning us? Eleanor thought of the headline, of the way her heart had leapt and knotted all at once. I do not know if I have room for regret, she admitted. It feels as though the ground has shifted beneath my feet. I am still checking if it will hold. And him? Marianne ventured, eyes bright. Has your opinion of him shifted as well? Yes, Eleanor said simply, and no. He is still the man who walked away when he should have stayed, but he is also the man who turned and came back, knowing the price. I do not quite know what to make of such a person. Marianne smiled faintly. Perhaps that is the beginning of something worth exploring. The true test came a week later, when the first major invitation arrived. The Harraways, Lady Ashbourne said, staring at the heavy cream card as if it might bite. They did not so much as nod at us for a decade, and now they invite us to their grand ball. Will we go? Marianne asked. Her mother hesitated. Then, slowly, she squared her shoulders. We will go, she said. They may stare at us from the edges of the room, but this time, Eleanor, you will not sit along the wall. Eleanor smiled a little ruefully. That is not entirely in my power, Mamma. Is it not? Lady Ashbourne's gaze softened unexpectedly. You underestimate how much you command by merely standing where you are meant to be. When they entered the Harraways' ballroom, Eleanor felt the familiar lurch in her stomach, the weight of chandeliers and gleaming floors, the hum of conversation that always seemed to flow around and never through her. But something was different. Heads turned, fans flicked open, men she barely knew bowed with more deference than the Ashbourne fortune in its modest heyday had ever commanded. Within minutes, a young gentleman with earnest brown eyes approached to ask for a dance. Eleanor accepted, surprised at how easily the old steps came when not dragged down by dread. Her dance card began to fill. It should have been exhilarating. For years she had imagined what it would feel like to be sought, to whirl under the chandeliers as part of the dance instead of its wallpaper, and yet, as partner, followed partner, a strange hollowness grew. They asked about the article, about the scandal, about the Duke, their questions wrapped in polite phrases. They praised her composure. Not one of them, she realized, asked who she was when her name was not the subject of the hour's gossip. Between dances, she found herself drifting toward the edge of the room out of habit, seeking the old refuge of the wall, and then stopping short, forcing herself back into the crowd. On the far side of the ballroom, a small commotion at the doorway made the musicians falter for a fraction of a moment. The Duke of Ravensfield had arrived. He wore black, as always, but tonight there was no mistaking the new quality in the air around him. Some faces turned away quickly, fearful of being seen staring at a man who had just placed his own name in the stocks of public opinion. Others looked with open fascination, whispering behind gloved hands. His gaze traveled the room once, taking in the shifting tides of attention. For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought he might seek her out at once. Instead, his eyes found her, and then deliberately moved past, as if he would give her room to breathe. He turned toward a group of older gentlemen near the doors, clearly intending to keep to the periphery. Something in Eleanor clenched. All at once, the image of herself at 16 flashed through her mind, the girl in the too thin blue gown clutching a blank dance card while the world spun without her, the man who had stood 20 feet away and done nothing. Now he stood 20 feet away again, prepared, it seemed, to do nothing for her sake. Before she had entirely decided to move, her feet were carrying her across the floor. "Your Grace," she said when she reached him, her voice steady in a way her heart was not. Conversations around them faltered. He turned, surprise flaring briefly in his eyes before it settled into something warmer, deeper. "Miss Ashbourne," he replied, bowing. "You look visible," she supplied, with a flicker of dry humor. "It appears your article has accomplished that much already." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I had hoped it might." She drew a breath. "I have been thinking a great deal about choices, Your Grace, about the ones other people made for me, and the ones I allowed to be made in my silence. There is something I must ask you." He straightened, suddenly very still. "Ask," he said. "If I accept your proposal," Eleanor said, aware that nearby conversations had gone very quiet indeed, "will everyone assume I have done so because you saved my family's name? Because I am grateful, or desperate, or easily bought?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Many will." "And if I refuse you?" He held her gaze. "Then they will say I am a fool and you are proud, and that the Ashbournes do not know on which side their bread is buttered." She nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it is time I did something that has nothing at all to do with what they will say." She extended her hand, palm upward between them, not in the formal line of a dance request, but as though offering him something invisible and immeasurable. "Will you walk with me, Your Grace?" Eleanor asked. "Somewhere we can speak plainly, without walls, without newspapers, without an audience that mistakes spectacle for truth." The room seemed to hold its breath again. Sebastian looked at her hand, at the woman who had once been a girl in blue pressed against a wall, and something in his expression broke open. "Gladly, Miss Ashbourne," he said, and placed his hand in hers. As they stepped together out of the glittering ballroom and into the shadowed quiet of the Harraways' winter garden, Eleanor felt for the first time in her life that the next step she took would be entirely, unequivocally her own. The winter garden was a world away from the dazzling heat of the ballroom. Cold air met them first, crisp and almost shocking after the press of perfume and candle smoke. Lanterns hung at intervals along the gravel path, their light softened by glass misted with breath and frost. Bare branches arched overhead like the ribs of some great sleeping beast, tipped with tiny crystals of ice that caught the glow and scattered it in muted sparks. For a few paces, they walked in silence. Eleanor was acutely aware of the crunch of gravel under her slippers, of the warmth of Sebastian's hand at her elbow as he guided her around an icy patch. The music was a distant murmur, behind them now, reduced to a faint rise and fall that sounded more like the sea than a waltz. "I thought," he said at last, "that I had forfeited the right to be alone with you the moment that article went to press." "You promised me a choice," she answered. "Choices cannot be made in rooms where the walls have ears." He huffed a breath, almost a laugh, though there was little amusement in it. "Trust you to notice the architecture of a moment." They reached a stone bench dusted with frost. Sebastian brushed the surface with his gloved hand before gesturing for her to sit. He remained standing as if too tightly coiled to rest. "You said you had something to ask," he prompted. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. "You have done a very dramatic thing for my family," she began. "You have taken blame, restored income, destroyed a portion of your reputation. Anyone looking at this from the outside would say I must marry you now. That honor demands it. Gratitude, decency." His jaw tightened. "Honor has already cost you enough." "Exactly," she said. "I will not tie myself to another man because the world insists I must. I spent 12 seasons sitting where others placed me. If I marry you, it must be because I choose it, not because Papa asked, or society expects it, or you sacrificed yourself on the altar of the morning edition." He studied her for a long moment, the cold lantern light carving sharp planes in his face. "Then do not marry me for any of those reasons," he said quietly. "Marry me, if you will, because you believe we might build something better out of the pieces left." She looked up at him. "And what precisely would we be building, Your Grace? A household where I smile at your guests while you seek your absolution elsewhere. A life where I am paraded as the proof of your redemption." He flinched almost imperceptibly. "You think so little of my imagination." "I think," Eleanor said, "that men are very skilled at repenting in ways that still keep them at the center of their own stories." Silence fell, softer than the one in the ballroom, but sharper too. When he spoke, his voice had lost its smoothness. "The gaming hell is already being sold," he said. "The dueling. Pistols have been given to my steward to melt down. I have a ledger in my study that lists every dockworker turned out when the scandal broke, every small investor who suffered when the tide ran against us. That is where my absolution lies, Miss Ashbourne. One name, one debt at a time. If you married me, I would expect you to read that ledger, argue with it, add to it when I am blind, not stand in a drawing room and glow for my benefit." A breath. She had not realized she was holding left her slowly. "And Lydia?" she asked very softly. "Would I be expected to live with her ghost at the breakfast table?" He did not look away. "Lydia is with me whether I sit at breakfast or stand on a battlefield," he said. "Her absence is stitched into the seams of my life. I will not pretend otherwise to make you comfortable, but I am not asking you to replace her. I am asking if you would help me ensure that what happened to her does not happen to another woman under my roof." The honesty of it, stark, unvarnished, settled somewhere deep in her. She rose from the bench so they stood level, cold biting pleasantly at her cheeks. "If I were to consider this," she said, "there would be conditions." His mouth quirked faintly. "I would expect nothing less. No gambling," she said. "No duels. No decisions made about my life without consulting me first, even if you believe it is for my protection. If I am to be a duchess, I will not be a decorative one. I will see your ledgers, hear your plans, disagree with you when necessary. And you must understand that if ever you try to push me back against a wall while the rest of the world dances, I will not stay there." He exhaled, something like relief ghosting through it. "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "On all counts. One more thing, Eleanor," added heart-knocking. "Yes? If none of this had happened," she said, "if there had been no scandal, no article, no letter from my father, if I had been just as I was a month ago, a woman half forgotten in blue at the edge of every room, would you have chosen me? Not out of guilt or duty, but out of preference." The question hung between them, bare and terrifying. Sebastian's gaze warmed, the severity of his features gentling as if someone had turned a lamp down behind his eyes. "Do you recall Lady Penbury's ball 3 years ago?" he asked. She frowned. "I recall a great many chairs and very few dances." "I recall," he said, "that when a young girl near you was mocked for tearing her hem, you took your own glass of lemonade and spilled it artfully over your skirt so she would not be the only spectacle. You sat there, sticky and damp, and let them laugh at you instead. You think I did." "Not see that, Eleanor." Her name on his tongue did something unsettling to her ribs. "I have watched you for 12 seasons, he continued, not only from guilt, but because you are the only person in half these rooms who seems to notice when someone else is drowning. That is the woman I am asking to stand at my side. Not a ghost, not a penance. You. The cold seemed to recede, leaving a strange, fierce warmth in its place. Eleanor looked back, toward the glow of the ballroom, where her mother and sister and 100 curious eyes waited. She could feel the paths of her life branching like those bare branches overhead, one leading back to the wall, safety and smallness, the other into a storm with this complicated, scarred man who was offering not rescue but partnership. "You said you wanted to mend a pattern," she murmured. "I think I do as well." She turned back to him, decision settling in her like a tide finally reaching the shore. "I will not give you my answer here in the shadows," she said. "All my greatest humiliations have taken place under chandeliers. If I choose you, it will be there that I claim it." His brow furrowed. "What do you propose?" "You will ask me for a waltz," she said, "once more, in front of them all. If I accept, they will know I did so, not because you cornered me in gardens and parlors, but because I stepped toward you of my own accord. If I refuse, they will see that too." A slow, incredulous smile touched his mouth, transforming his whole face. "You mean to make a spectacle of your choice, Miss Ashbourne?" "At last," she said, feeling something bright and frighteningly like joy spark in her chest. "The spectacle will be mine." They walked back toward the ballroom side by side. At the threshold, he paused. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "I will not regret a single step that brought us to this door." She met his gaze, nodded once, and slipped back into the blaze of light. The musicians were just taking their places for the next waltz. Conversations hummed, gossip simmered, fans fluttered like nervous birds. Across the room, Lady Ashbourne's face was pale, Marianne's eyes wide with hope. The first notes of the waltz unfurled. The Duke of Ravensfield stepped forward. This time, as he began to cross the floor toward her, Eleanor did not think of herself as an object being approached, but as a force waiting to meet him halfway. He crossed the floor as though retracing an old path. Only this time, she was not waiting at the end of it like something forgotten. Eleanor stepped forward. A murmur swept through the crowd at that simple reversal. Instead of a duke descending upon a wallflower, it was Miss Ashbourne who moved out from the cluster of ladies and matrons, meeting him not at the edge but in the full light at the center of the room. She stopped halfway, leaving a small distance between them, just enough to make it clear that this was a choice, not a foregone conclusion. Sebastian halted too, understanding flashing in his eyes. For a moment the ballroom was suspended, music poised on the brink, conversations trailing into incomplete sentences. Fans held mid-flutter. He bowed. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest circles, "may I have this waltz?" Eleanor felt 100 gazes prickling her skin. Somewhere to her left, she sensed Marianne's breathless hope. To her right, her mother's rigid, frightened stillness. She drew in a breath that seemed to pull the last 12 seasons into her lungs. "This waltz," she replied, letting her voice lift over the hush, "is mine to choose." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Then choose," he said softly. She extended her hand. "I do." The words were quiet enough to be intimate, but loud enough that more than one nearby matron blinked, certain they had heard something dangerously close to a vow. His fingers closed around hers, steady and warm. As they moved into position, the musicians, bless them, seized their cue and launched into the waltz. This time with a flourish that bordered on triumphant. They began to turn. The crowd fell away into a blur of color and candlelight. Eleanor's skirt whispered against the polished floor. His hand rested at the small of her back, firm and certain without being possessive. It felt less like being led than like being partnered. "Well," he murmured as they completed the first turn, "am I to know my fate before the final bar, or will you torment me through the entire piece?" She almost laughed, the sound rising from somewhere that had been too long silent. "You, your grace, have withstood pistols and parliament. I think you can survive a waltz." "Not this one," he said, and there was no jest in it. She lifted her gaze to his. The lanterns from the garden threw a faint, cool glow through the high windows, softening the sharp lines of his face. He looked younger, she realized suddenly, not in years, but in possibility. "I meant what I said," Eleanor told him. "If I give you my answer, it must be here where I once learned to be ashamed, under these chandeliers, in the sight of those who thought I would rot quietly against their walls. And what is your answer?" His voice was very low now, nearly stolen by the sweep of violins. She felt her heart pound against her ribs, but the fear that had sat there for 12 years seemed to have shifted into something fiercer. "I will marry you," she said. For a fraction of a beat his steps faltered, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough that she felt the jolt through their joined hands. Then his grip tightened, and his gaze burned. "Say it again," Sebastian whispered, as though he could not quite believe his ears. She tipped her head slightly, allowing the movement to seem like part of the dance. "I will marry you," Eleanor repeated, more firmly. "Not because you cleared my name, not because Papa asked, not because society expects me to be grateful. I will marry you because I believe we can build something better than the stories we've been given. And because," she added, surprising herself as much as him, "I like the man you are trying to become." His jaw clenched as if the word struck somewhere raw. "You may yet find the reality wanting. Then we will improve it," she said. "Together." Something almost like wonder flickered across his features. His thumb brushed once unconsciously against her gloved fingers. "Eleanor," he said, her name a quiet vow. The final swell of the waltz rose around them. As they turned through the last pattern, she became acutely aware that many of the nearest dancers had given up pretending not to watch. Lady Harroway's mouth hung slightly open. A young lady Eleanor did not know smiled, outright as if savoring the shock rippling through the room. The last note faded. For a heartbeat, silence held, the kind that falls just before a verdict. Sebastian did not step away. Still holding her hand, he turned toward the crowd, toward Lady Ashbourne's pale, rigid figure near the edge of the floor. He did not make a spectacle of kneeling. He did not lift his voice in some theatrical declaration. That would have been too easy, Eleanor thought. Too much like performance, not enough like truth. Instead, he walked with her across the floor, as though they had both been heading there all along. "Lady Ashbourne," he said when they reached her, bowing his head. The surrounding company obligingly took one discreet step closer, ears sharpened by curiosity. "With your permission, I would speak plainly." Her mother's fan trembled. "Plain speech has caused enough disruption of late, Your Grace. Then allow it one more offense." He looked not at the crowd, but at the woman who had guarded her daughters with pride as her only sword. "I have asked Miss Ashbourne to be my wife. She has given me her consent. I now ask for yours." A ripple went through the onlookers like wind through grass. Lady Ashbourne's gaze darted to Eleanor's face, searching. "Is this truly your wish?" she asked, and for the first time the command had leached from her tone, leaving only a mother's raw fear. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Yes, Mama. You would bind yourself to the man whose name sits atop that article, whose house is full of whispers and ghosts." "Yes," Eleanor said again, "because his ghosts are named now. I know what haunts him, and he knows what has haunted us. We will not be stumbling in the dark." Her mother's eyes filled unexpectedly. "I wanted better for you than compromise," she whispered. "This is not compromise," Eleanor answered gently. "This is a beginning. For both of us." She reached out, touching Lady Ashbourne's clenched hand. "You taught me to survive, Mama. Let me choose how I will live." For a long moment, the older woman did not move. Then, with the air of someone laying down a weapon she has held too long, Lady Ashbourne slowly turned her hand under Eleanor's and squeezed. "Very well," she said, voice rough. "If you see a future where I see only old wounds, I will trust your eyes." She lifted her gaze to Sebastian. "You have broken us once, Your Grace. If you break her, I do not care how high your walls are. I will find a way over them." A low murmur of half-shocked approval circled them. Sebastian bowed his head, solemn. "On that point, my lady, we are allies." The musicians, sensing that the room needed its rhythm restored, struck up another tune. Conversations resumed in a rush, louder than before, bubbling with speculation. Marianne flung herself at Eleanor's side, whispering a rapid, tearful stream of delight that Eleanor only half heard. For one shining moment, it seemed that the worst of the storm had passed. Then a voice, sharp and carrying, sliced through the din. "Ravensfield!" A man shouldered through the edge of the crowd, a broad-shouldered fellow with a florid face and a scar along his cheek that spoke of less civilized encounters than ballrooms. Eleanor recognized him vaguely. Mr. Carroway, perhaps, a cousin of the man Sebastian had wounded in that disastrous duel. He stopped a few feet away, eyes glittering with something uglier than curiosity. "I see the rumors were true," Carroway drawled. "You mean to wash your name clean with a wedding and a few pretty speeches in the press. Tell me, Your Grace, will your new Duchess find you at the gaming tables or on the field at dawn?" The nearest guest stiffened, scandalized and avid in equal measure. Sebastian's shoulders went very still. Eleanor felt the room tilt again, old patterns rising like ghosts from the floorboards. Challenge, insult, blood at daybreak. Carroway smiled, thin and edged. "My brother still carries your bullet, Ravensfield. If you are so eager to confess your sins these days, perhaps you'd care to finish what you started, with a proper duel this time." A hush fell so sudden and deep that even the music seemed to fade beneath it. Sebastian's hand flexed at his side. For a heartbeat, Eleanor saw the man he had been, the one who never walked away from a challenge, who mistook pride for honor and blood for proof. His gaze flicked to her, just once. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. This, she realized with crystal clarity, was the true measure. Not the article, not the waltz, not the promises whispered under lantern light. Would he choose her, or the ghosts of the man he used to be? Sebastian Blackthorne drew in a breath and opened his mouth to answer. Sebastian's gaze did not leave Carraway's. For a terrible heartbeat, Eleanor saw his shoulders square, saw the old instinct coil through him like a muscle remembering a wound. The room leaned forward, hungry. This was the story they knew how to tell. Insult, challenge, dawn, blood. Sebastian drew in a long, slow breath. "No," he said. The single syllable fell into the hush like a stone into still water. Carraway blinked. "No, no," Sebastian repeated more evenly. "I will not fight you." A collective gasp rustled through the room. Somewhere a gentleman murmured, "Coward," under his breath, testing the word as though it were a new fashion. Carraway's lip curled. "I'm afraid, Ravensfield, that your aim will be truer this time." "I am quite certain of my aim," Sebastian said, and there was a flicker of the old iron in his voice. "That is the problem. I have no desire to test it on your brother again, or on you. The fact that I did not kill him does not excuse the fact that I put us both in that field." He stepped closer, not threatening, but unflinching. "I will meet you at your brother's bedside if he wishes. Geert, I will apologize to his face. I will pay his expenses, fund his care, ensure his children never want for bread. That is the sort of satisfaction I can offer. But I will not stand at dawn and put another bullet in your family to prove I am sorry." Carraway's color darkened. "You refuse a challenge in public and call it honor? You think a few coins and one weepy article make you a better man?" "I think," Sebastian said, "that killing your brother did not improve me. Refusing to finish the job might." His jaw clenched. "Call it what you will, cowardice, hypocrisy. Some of it will be true. But I am finished spilling blood because someone shouted my name in a crowded room." "You'd let him say that?" Carraway snapped, looking to the nearest men. "You'd all let him walk away?" The room shifted uneasily. No one seemed eager to step into the space between them. Eleanor moved. She did not. Think, not really. Her feet simply carried her one pace forward until she stood at Sebastian's side, her hand finding his sleeve with a steadiness that surprised her. "Mr. Carraway," she said, and her voice, though not loud, carried. "You are angry. You have every right to be. Your brother paid a price he should never have had to pay." Carraway's gaze flicked to her, startled. "This is no matter for ladies, Miss Ashbourne." "On the contrary," she replied, "it is precisely a matter for ladies. We are the ones who wait while men go out at dawn. We are the ones who sit beside sickbeds and graves while the world praises honor and forgets the empty chairs at our tables." A murmur, softer, ran through the listening women. She lifted her chin. 12 seasons, I sat against these walls while stories were told about my family that were not quite true. I know what it is to be spoken of, instead of listened to. If you wish to call Sebastian Blackthorne a coward because he will not shoot at you, you may. But hear this. I am marrying a man who can walk away from a loaded pistol and toward a difficult apology. If you think less of him for it, that is a story you are choosing to keep. Carraway stared at her, thrown off balance by an enemy he had not expected to face, a woman's calm. Lady Harroway, sensing her duty as hostess, glided forward, her smile fixed and brittle. "Mr. Carraway, I am certain this conversation can be continued in a more private setting. My floor is for dancing, not dueling." Marianne's husband, the amiable baron who had always preferred books to bullets, stepped to Sebastian's other side with quiet resolve. "If you persist in disturbing my hostess's ball," he said mildly, "I shall be forced to request that you leave, unchallenged." The word landed with deliberate irony. For a long moment Carraway's fists clenched and unclenched, then with a muttered oath he bowed, stiff, mocking, and shouldered his way back through the crowd. The tension in the room broke like a held breath. Conversations burst forth, too bright, too quick. The musicians, brave souls, snatched up the tune again, as if music itself might plaster over the cracks in the evening. Eleanor realized she was still holding Sebastian's sleeve. She let go slowly. "You chose," she said quietly, not quite looking at him. "It appears," he replied, a little hoarsely, "that I did." Her lips curved. "This is good. I have no intention of rising at dawn to watch you posture in meadows." "A pity," he murmured. "I had heard it was very romantic." She laughed, the sound catching at the edges with leftover fear. "If you wish romance at dawn, Your Grace, you may bring me tea and not wake me until it is ready." He looked at her as if someone had just placed a priceless artifact in his hands and warned him not to drop it. "I find," he said slowly, "that I would very much like to do exactly that." The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Some guests offered congratulations, others offered thinly veiled warnings about the difficulties of reforming a man like Ravensfield. Eleanor smiled where politeness demanded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, already stepping into a future that felt both terrifying and strangely solid underfoot. They were married in the spring. The day was bright, but not ostentatious, much like the ceremony itself. In the quiet of the church, Eleanor felt her father's absence keenly, and yet reading his letter once more the night before, she had sensed his presence too, in the steadiness of her own hand as she signed the register. Lady Ashbourne wept openly, to the scandalized joy of the congregation. Marianne's boys scattered petals with chaotic enthusiasm down the aisle. When Sebastian slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembled. "I will spend the rest of my life," he whispered, so only she could hear, "trying to deserve this moment." "You will fail sometimes," she whispered back, "as will I. That is how lives work, Your Grace. We will mend what we can, together." Months later, in the grand ballroom of Ravensfield House, the chandeliers burned as bright as any she had ever seen. The world had not forgotten their scandals. Scandals are too precious to be forgotten, but it had learned, reluctantly, to make room for something more complicated. At the first ball she hosted as Duchess, Eleanor made certain there were chairs along the wall. She also made certain they were never occupied for long. When she saw a young woman tucked into a corner, fingers worrying the edge of an empty dance card, Eleanor crossed the room without hesitation. Sometimes she sent a kind young gentleman in that direction with a murmured suggestion. Sometimes, when the music was right and the courage in her chest matched the courage in the girl's eyes, she simply offered her own hand and said, "Come, let us start with standing." Sebastian watched her, more often than he danced. When their gazes met, across the whirl of the floor, there was a shared understanding there, of storms weathered, debts paid, patterns broken. Eleanor still wore blue sometimes, but now, when she stepped into the center of the room, it was not as a girl waiting to be chosen. It was as a woman who had chosen for herself at last. Years later, when people spoke of Eleanor Ashbourne, they liked to tell the story of the feared duke who crossed the floor for the forgotten girl at the wall. It is a good story as far as it goes, but the truer story is this. One day she crossed the floor for herself. Perhaps listening now, you know something of those long seasons of being overlooked, of sitting quietly at the edge while life seems to waltz past without you. Perhaps you have worn your family's mistakes or someone else's choices, like a gown you never asked for. Eleanor's tale is not about a man who rescued her. It is about a woman who learned that her worth was never measured by the number of names on a card or the whispers in a room. It is about a man who chose to turn back from the worst of himself, not because someone demanded it, but because he was finally brave enough to be different. We do not all get ducal proposals or headlines that shout our redemption, but we do get moments, small, ordinary, terrifying, when we can stand up from the wall, when we can say, "This step is mine," when we can choose people who are trying honestly to be better and let go of those who love their ghosts more than they love us. If your life has felt like 12 long seasons of waiting, remember, the dance does not truly begin when someone else points at you. It begins the moment you decide you are worth stepping into the light for, even if your hands still tremble, and when the music rises, whatever it sounds. Like for you, I hope you remember Eleanor and the way she lifted her hand and said, "This waltz is mine to choose."